Last year, I made a video where I used Windows 7 in 2023. That video was overall received pretty well, although there was a few people in the comments who took issue with what I was doing because I was using old hardware. It's now 2024, and I have better Windows 7 hardware, and I want to see how later era Windows 7 hardware performs with Windows 7 in 2024. The first note that I have is that I am not going to put Windows 7 on some high-end machine from the Windows 10 era. This video is not about only using Windows 7 in 2024, but also using the hardware that Windows 7 was current with. I want to make that very clear, as a lot of people didn't understand that on my original video. With that out of the way, starting off with a very basic test that any somewhat modern computer can do, browsing the web. This laptop is able to browse the web, although browser compatibility is much worse than it was last year. I had to download an old version of Firefox, which is still recent and works well enough, although being the extended support release, this browser will not get any new future updates, and it will eventually lose security updates. With that said, this browser feels a lot slower than the same hardware on a newer version of Windows would. It feels like this browser is less optimized for the OS, and one comparison that I made last year was an iPhone 10 versus an old laptop, and people did not like that. The reason I bring this comparison up is that most people have a phone that is newer than an iPhone 10, and if it's faster to just use an app, why use a desktop operating system? I understand that there are some websites that are just plain better than the app version, but things will generally load faster on a somewhat new phone than a pretty old laptop. This HP EliteBook that I'm using really isn't an exception. It's from around 2012. I'd say basically anything newer than an iPhone 11 could beat it in any realistic task. Of course, the computer's going to be a lot more versatile, but that's not really what the point of this test would be. Anyway, app support on Windows 7 is coming to a close basically. Premiere Pro, Sony Vegas, and DaVinci Resolve all require Windows 10, along with, to my knowledge, the entire Adobe Creative Cloud suite, which a lot of people really do need for their computers. Steam requires Windows 10, every major browser requires Windows 10, and it's really hard to find programs that just directly work with Windows 7, no old versions, nothing like that. That's the current biggest issue in my opinion, as using this OS basically means being stuck on old programs, and while right now the programs are only a couple months, maybe a couple years out of date, in the future that's not going to be a couple months, that's going to be multiple years out of date. To my knowledge, Microsoft supported Windows 7 with Office up to 2021, from what I can tell, but I'm not sure how accurate that is, seeing as by 2021, Windows 7 was already discontinued, and that's when Microsoft was getting ready or already released Windows 11, so I would just make sure with Microsoft about that. Although as long as there's a somewhat up-to-date web browser, the Google Office suite would work, and I think that's kind of better than Microsoft Office anyway, so it's not really that big of an issue unless somebody's just dead set on using Microsoft Office, which I could see a couple of reasons why people would. Surprisingly, another Microsoft app, Skype, still supports Windows 7. It surprises me because it seems like the kind of app that Microsoft would be quick to drop support on, but as far as I can tell, Skype still works on Windows 7. One of my favorite parts about using Windows 7 is the arrow design. I've always really liked the glass look that it has and how everything just looks proper. It's something that Microsoft doesn't do anymore, and it makes the entire OS look and feel a lot cleaner and more proper than some of Microsoft's new operating systems. Another thing that Windows 7 does much better than Windows 10 or 11 is the setup process. I don't really care who you ask, this is just true. There is no requirement for a Microsoft account on Windows 7, there's little to no bloatware or third-party apps on a fresh install, not counting stuff that was shipped with the laptop or desktop, and it's easy just to set up and create a fully offline experience, which is impossible on newer versions of Windows 10 and Windows 11 as a whole, at least without some modified ISO. One thing that I will give Microsoft for Windows 10 though, possibly the only thing that I enjoy about that OS, is how easy it is to get a computer running. All of the drivers seem to be there by default when I spent over an hour getting drivers for this HP EliteBook on Windows 7. Windows 7 is from an era where not all computers were connected to the internet, and where some people just bought a computer to use for basic programs like Microsoft Office or playing DVDs. And now the entire point of Windows 11 is to be interconnected into Microsoft services, where tracking and limitations are easily implemented. I can't even start to explain how many Windows 10 laptops I've seen running awfully just really slow after only being used for a couple of years. But Windows 7 seems to stay a good bit faster after being used for a while, as long as it's got an SSD in it really. It's also from when Microsoft didn't try to get money out of their consumers at every point possible, with some good examples being OneDrive, Microsoft 365, and data collection on Windows 10 and 11. With Windows 7, when I change my default browser, it doesn't keep trying to make me use Microsoft's own browser. It was back when macOS was macOS, and I didn't have to constantly make sure the computer isn't doing some shady stuff in the background. The way I think about Windows is that it is not a free OS. The license key costs money, and when purchasing a new computer from a company, that license key is part of the cost associated with buying the computer. I've also heard the argument, I'm paying to use the OS, not to own the OS. And I understand that, but there's a point where I think that if I'm paying $99 for a product key for Windows, I should be able to change basic things about the OS. And I don't know how the DOJ or the EU hasn't gone after Microsoft for this, but they go after Apple for everything that they do. For an OS that is paid, the fact that I'm forced into making a Microsoft account so that they can track me even further and send me constant marketing emails is insane. And I think that Microsoft needs to take a massive step away from the online experience and go back to what made Windows 7 so good, the simplicity, the user experience. Yes, Microsoft designed everything with Windows 10, and it's their OS at the end of the day. But if I'm paying money for their product or their license key, I should have the right to disable basic things that interfere with the user experience. I know this is going to sound a bit counterproductive with how much Apple locks down their hardware, but this entire experience with Windows 10 is why I use macOS. I'm not forced into Safari, or updates, or signing into any accounts. I can more or less do what I want with my data, and I'm not forced into any services that I don't want to use. That is how a desktop OS should be, and Microsoft is going towards the opposite of that with Windows 10 and 11. If Microsoft didn't screw up Windows 11 so bad, then programs and software like Tiny11 would not have a reason to exist. So now that I've basically talked about everything I wanted to with Windows 7, I'm going to answer the question, is it usable in 2024? Yes, it is usable, although it depends on the person, because someone who does a lot of creative work, like Photoshop, Adobe Premiere Pro, or really any video editor, will not have a good time on this. I can't say that anybody should use this OS primarily because of the security issues, because this OS hasn't had security patches in a couple of years now. But for those who know what they're doing, this OS could be usable, it could be a fun experience, and enthusiasts will probably have a good time going back and enjoying all the old features that Windows 7 had to offer from the 2000s era. With that said, thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, a like would be appreciated, and goodbye.